Join the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra for Regeneration with Canopy Dance. Explore music and movement as Canopy Dance Company joins the orchestra on stage. The evening will feature 3 world premieres, 2 local composers, and a piece by a Grammy-nominated composer. Join the WCO on Friday, February 27th at 7:30 p.m. Tickets are available at wcoconcerts.org/regeneration. Clear your calendar for March 20th and get ready to party for a purpose. Toto's Gala returns to Monona Terrace for a one-night fundraising celebration supporting Dane County Humane Society and the animals who count on them. Enjoy incredible food, flowing drinks, inspiring stories, and yes, adorable animals. Grab your friends, dress to impress, and be part of a night where fun and giving go hand in hand, coming together for good. Tickets are on sale now, and RSVPs close March 6th. Get your tickets today at giveshelter.org/Toto. This is CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about.
Should Madison City Council be smaller? Earlier this month, Madison's Common Council Executive Committee discussed reducing the number of alders and raising the salary of the remaining alders. But if you're having a little bit of deja vu here, don't freak out. Voters sounded off on this topic in 2021 and ultimately decided to keep our current 20 part-time alder setup. So what are we doing here again? I'm CityCast Madison executive producer Haley Sperling, sitting in for your host Bianca Martin. And joining me today to break down this story is our very own CityCast Madison producer, Jade Isiri Ramos. Welcome to the microphone, Jade.
Hey, Haley. How crazy 5 years passes so fast, right?
So fast. And there's so much to dig in here. And just even a little bit of context before we get into this, Jade, you had a life before CityCast Madison. You were a reporter over at WORT for a while, and you did a lot of reporting here. So this is why we're talking to you. And I want to dig into the long history of this conversation in which you did all that reporting. But before that, let's get into the news. So what was this most recent conversation about, and who was involved?
Yeah, so what we're talking about is a conversation that happened at the February Executive Committee meeting, which is a meeting of leadership. So that's Council President Vidaveer and VP Govindarajan, and then 6 other council members. So that's Matthews, Lakella, Madison, Tischler, Figueroa Cole, and Ugair. And they were all present at this meeting. They had quorum. And President Regina Vidaveer brought up the conversation about whether or not to pursue a higher paid legislative body. It was just a discussion topic. There was no voting. There was no action being taken. But her proposal is to cut 5 alder positions and use the salaries of those 5 alders to increase the wages of the remaining 15. And it was hot. It was a heated debate, Haley, I have to tell you.
All right, so give me a vibe check here. You said things were heated. Like, what were some of the responses to this conversation? Are people in favor of it so far, or do they have reservations?
Yeah, so this conversation was quite respectful, but overall, the alders were concerned about the amount of work for the amount of pay not being nearly enough. So all alders would get about a $5,000 raise under this plan. Right now, alders make about $17,000, with the VP and the president making a couple $1,000s more than that. And if the city was to go from 20 alders to 15 alders, they would have about 5,000 more constituents per alder, which is a lot of constituents. And also $5,000 isn't enough for alders to, quit their full-time jobs if they have full-time jobs in order to, take on this extra workload. So in theory, it's a little bit more money for a lot more work was the overall consensus.
Yeah, and I feel like it doesn't take a whole lot to see that there, right? That's a lot. Our alders do not get paid a lot, but on purpose, right? We have, like I mentioned, 20 part-time alders. And I'm curious to know too, did this conversation go anywhere? Should folks expect to sound off on this subject anytime soon?
So no, basically the overall consensus was it's too soon to have this conversation. Let's wait until at least 2030 when we have a new census and we have a better understanding of what the population of our city looks like and the population of these districts. And again, I'll remind folks that every 10 years, the city of Madison does a redistricting because populations in different districts change.
Too soon to tell is what they're saying then. And I'm having a sense of deja vu. Jade, I'm sure you're having some deja vu because back in 2021, voters voiced their opinion on basically this exact same subject. And Jade, like I mentioned at the top, you were a reporter with WORT News during this time and reported on that referendum. So let's go back to 2021. What was on that ballot and what were the results? What did the people of Madison say to these questions?
Yeah, Haley, when we first started talking about this story, I was like, we just talked about this. Like, we as a city just had this conversation and it was on our ballots. So there were 4 questions in 2021, spring of 2021, like exactly this time, 5 years ago. And the questions were, should alders be full-time? Should the council size change? Should there be 4-year terms? And should there be a term limit? And the results of those questions for should alders be full-time, 58% said no. Should the council stay the same? 70% said yes, stay the same, with 16 saying decrease and 13 saying increase. Should there be a 4-year term? 56% said no, so that was a little bit more, half and half. And should there be term limits? Overwhelmingly, 71% of folks said yes, there should be term limits.
Interesting. It's really interesting here that we really are split on the full time and the terms, like 4-year terms versus the 2-year terms that they're currently serving. And should alders be full time versus part time? This is something that our city has been grappling with for a long time, honestly, and everyone does it very differently. So let's break it down because, like we said, there's a lot of people that have many opinions on both sides here. So what were the arguments potentially for a smaller council who would make more money?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because we can't have this conversation without talking about a specific committee, which is now defunct. But there was this task force on government structure, or TFOGs, as was called sort of in the city and in newsrooms across the city. The TFOGs made recommendations that were largely about making sure that the council could be more accessible for people of color and people who are low income. And so the task force had these recommendations, and a lot of these questions that were on the ballot, such as full-time, the size of the council being less, and there being 4-year terms, were all things that the task force on government structure recommended. And the pros for that is they wanted people to make more money so there would be less of a financial barrier for folks who would like to serve. Basically saying that at this point with, people making $17,000 on council, that's not enough for someone to take this job if they're not already in a relatively privileged position, right? Either they have the flexibility with their current job that they can do this job on top of it, or they have, a partner who's making more money, they're independently wealthy, they're retired, all these things that are relatively privileged. The main pro is that, plus the idea that if you have people who are full-time, they have more capacity to deal with the issues within their district.
And that makes sense, right? Because these alders, by many accounts, say that they're spending anywhere between 10 to 25 hours, and in some cases even more, a week working on city council duties. Because as we know, Madison loves its committees, loves its commissions. We have so many of them. So in addition to sitting on these city council meetings, which often go late into the night, they're also working on committee meetings, every other week and whatnot. And there's a lot to take track of, especially when it comes to conversing with their constituents, which is huge. It's a big time commitment. And like you said, Jade, it's harder for folks who are working 9 to 5 or who might be working 2 jobs to also seek out and want to serve their community, despite the fact that they might also have really good ideas. So let's follow up with that. What were the arguments against making this change, because there were some pretty big voices out there who really did not want this to happen. And that includes, even back in 2021, the Wisconsin State Journal editorial board put out a column that was very staunchly against this referendum. So what's on the other side of the coin here?
Yeah, so one of the things that was talked about a lot is that alders making more money, making a full-time salary. Again, the question on the ballot was saying, should alders make somewhere between $45,000 to $71,000 per year? People who are against this were concerned that that would increase the likelihood of having sort of career alders, people who are trying to get in the job and stay in the job, rather than people with vast varieties of backgrounds who are doing this out of their civic duty, I guess. Another con is that if alders have larger districts, there's less likely to have personal connections to the people in that district, which again, I think is that's a con, but that could also be a plus, right? So like if there were full-time alders, perhaps people would have more time to be reaching out to their constituents. So it's a pro and a con, depending on what side you're on. And then a big con about having less alders is losing the student seat, right? If there are only 10, or in this new proposal, 15 alders, the likelihood of having a seat specifically held for a UW-Madison student seems like it would be less likely to happen.
Yeah. And we're referring here to is District 8, currently held by City Council Vice President MGR Govindarajan. So clearly he's been able to make that work with his student schedule. But I can't imagine how hard that is.
And I will say that MGR is no longer a student, but he is not running for re-election, so his seat is back up. 2 students are currently running for that position.
Sure. And of course, like that it's not reserved for students, but because it represents so much of the UW-Madison campus area, it is typically held and represented by a usually UW-Madison student. So there's a lot to take in here. There's a lot of different arguments. I mean, it ultimately comes down to, what do we value most here? I think for me, do we want politicians politicking in city council, or do we want people politicking in city council? I think there are a lot of folks who think that, having someone who has a full-time job outside of city council is a really valuable perspective to bring to a city government. But like we mentioned, that also prohibits them from potentially reaching their full potential, I guess, on city government, or being able to really do as much as they want to.
Yeah, and we just saw last year someone drop out of the race, right? We saw Alder Martinez Rutherford drop out of her race last year because she was saying she couldn't afford to represent the district. And so I think that it's real, right? It's like we can talk about it sort of like theoretically someone might not be able to run, but this is a real situation where someone dropped out of the race and was later elected, but dropped out of the race for financial reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that is a really great encapsulation of both sides of that coin there, right? Because Dina Nina Martinez Rutherford, she represents the East Side District 15. Like you mentioned, Jade, she dropped out and people elected her anyways. They clearly value her perspective. And it's just a really unique problem that we've got here. And I'm curious too, Jade, I mentioned that city council members say they typically work between 10 to 25 hours on city council duties a week. Have you ever sat through a city council meeting?
I have, and also I haven't in person. So I think that the advent of video and streaming has really changed the way that local reporters can report on these things. So I have watched plenty on YouTube after the fact at like 2 times speed to make sure I get the whole story, or sat sort of, and this really became a big thing in 2020 of sitting in a Zoom room and watching hours of council meetings. I mean, like you mentioned at the top, Haley, they can be going for till midnight, 1 a.m. They get going.
They go late. They go late. That is actually how I started my reporting journey as a city reporter for the Badger Herald. And I remember walking into the city council meeting room for the first time and one, being like, where do I sit? And two, being like, this is a long meeting. And those are long meetings. And you know what else are long meetings? Plan commission are long meetings. Landmarks are long meetings. There's so many long meetings. I wish they could all be in 2-point speed. But because of that, I bring it up because a part of this argument to move to a smaller council, especially to move to an odd numbered council, is to move away from having ties and having the mayor being ultimately the final voice on everything, which I do think is quite interesting, right? 20 voices. That's a lot of people in the room. And if it comes down to 10 to 10, then the mayor gets to do ultimately what they want to do. So I think there's a lot to take in with both sides of these arguments here.
Madison, meet your new secret weapon, TaskRabbit. TaskRabbit officially launched in our city last June, and Madisonians are already using TaskRabbit services to make their lives easier. And I know that's true because I have used TaskRabbit on numerous occasions, particularly for moving and setting up my place. From furniture assembly to painting, they've got a tasker for that. Simply download the app, describe your needed task, and browse profiles of skilled neighbors who can help you today. And you know what else is a huge plus? Their transparent pricing. You'll see the hourly rate upfront, which includes the tasker's rate and the service fee, so there are no surprises at checkout. And you can decide what works for you and what you're willing to pay. So what are you waiting for? Find your first tasker today at TaskRabbit.com or on the app.
This most recent conversation about 15 alders who make $5,000 more and represent 5,000 more people is just the latest conversation about what is a problem, right? Which is we're a growing city and the council likely needs to change, but how the council is going to change is still really up for debate and people are sounding off about it.
Absolutely. I think also, too, for what it's worth, it makes a lot of sense to revisit this in 2030 after our next census, because as we know, Madison, like you said, growing city, Dane County, growing county, there are a lot of people coming here. And there are a lot of people who have thoughts on this idea. We actually shared this story in our CityCast Madison newsletter recently, and some readers sounded off in our inbox. Jade, do you want to tell us what our first reader said?
Yeah, Brenda F. kept it nice and short and sweet and said, we should have less. 20 is too many.
Fair. I mean, that's too many cooks. Why not? Tom M. said he likes the 15 alders idea, and larger districts means that they have to support a broader and more diverse base, which, again, also a good point. If you've got more people, they've got more ideas, more things to say.
Brady S. says, yes, I think we should go down to 15 alders that are full-time. A city our size needs full-time staff to focus on issues, and the position should pay well enough that they can dedicate their time to our needs. One thing that's interesting, Haley, about the 15 alders is that 15 alders that are full-time is how Milwaukee operates. And so if we're sort of looking at Milwaukee as sort of where we're going as far as population size goes, you know, they're doing 15 alders who are full-time with staff.
That makes a lot of sense. Though, again, that does go back to politicians politicking, right?
Yeah.
Our next reader, Cole S., said that, quote, they like the idea of odd number to avoid ties and redistributing salaries is appealing. They also ask how much do alders make anyways? But generally speaking, more representatives translates to better representation. They ask maybe cut down to 19 for now. Ideally, there would be rules in place scaling the number of alders to the population of the city, which is an interesting concept. As we said, alders right now typically make about $17,000. Leadership makes a little bit more. They also have an expenditure budget that they get to spend. But again, this is a very, very part-time gig. And it's interesting that Cole brings up maybe just cutting it down to 19 or a smaller number for now. That's something that former Mayor Paul Soglin actually brought up in 2019 during the mayoral race when we were also having this conversation. Once again, he suggested cutting the city council down to between 16 to 18 alders. But as a counter to that, Kathy W. wrote into us and she said that the number of alders should be kept at 20. She said, quote, "Our population keeps growing, and thus each alder is representing more and more people. Plus, the mayor should vote the tiebreaker. It's their job. It also gives us a perspective on how he or she feels about that issue."
Yeah, I love that our readers and listeners have such a variety of perspectives on this. I had not thought about a mayor breaking the tie is a positive thing. And our last writer, Jenny W., felt pretty similar. She left us a long note. She said, "Wisely, Madison voters rejected the idea of a full-time alder position in 2021, the last time the idea was floated. There are already too many special interest groups meddling in the alder election process. Developers, realtors, partisan politician parties, to name a few. Career alder positions would offer more incentives for individuals and groups to try to capture and hold them. We saw what happened to the state legislature when the position became full-time with a generous benefits package. Elected officials and political parties became entrenched, and the legislature became more dysfunctional. Being an alder should remain a side gig, not a path to full-time employment."
Jenny's got a lot to say here. And honestly, this is probably what a lot of Madison voters were thinking back in 2021. They don't want these career politicians. It is interesting, too, that she brings up all of the other outside special interest groups who have thoughts on this. And I think the realtors and developers, that's a really big one here. We saw even in the last city council race that there were outside interest groups spending money to get one of their candidates elected, and they didn't even coordinate with this candidate. You know, there's a lot more attention, I think, being paid to these races now. So it is important that we kind of consider what we want our council to look like in terms of how they operate, because there are going to be more than just the city council people involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a through line through almost all of these was that we want our representatives representing us well. And I think that that's sort of at the crux of this conversation is we as a city, we as sort of a culture value the work that our alders do, but we have differing ideas about how they can do that the best.
Absolutely. I mean, Madison, you couldn't have said it better. We got a lot of ideas.
We got a lot of ideas. And that's one of the reasons why I think that these city council meetings go so long is that we do have 20 people with strong opinions and constituents and stakeholders who are talking to them. And so these council meetings are long, but it's because the city council, for the most part, are having thoughtful conversations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, like we've said throughout this conversation, too, people are really clearly interested in this topic. So, Jade, I mean, what do you think that there's this level of community engagement, even in our inbox, but also going back to 2021, you know, when we started these conversations?
Yeah. And, you know, even before 2021, right, the TFOGs, the Task Force on Government Structure, that was proposed in 2017 and came out with these recommendations around 2019, 2020. So it's something that we have been thinking about and talking about and getting input from community members about. And I think until something changes, we're going to continue having conversations about it. And I imagine that we are going to hear people writing opinion pieces. We're going to be hearing people on soapboxes. We're going to be hearing about this in Common Council committee meetings until a change happens.
And if people want, they can come soapbox right here on this podcast. Send us an email, madison@citycast.fm, or make your voice heard. You can call in and leave us a voicemail. That number is 608-318-3367. You heard it here first. Soapbox on CityCast Madison. Jade, before we wrap up this conversation, I just want to ask, is there anything that you think folks should keep in mind when considering this larger conversation in the makeup of city council and our local governmental representation?
Yeah, Haley, in this reporting, I was thinking a lot about your recent conversation with Noah Bladorn from REAP. And you guys were having a conversation about the Dane County Food Action Plan. And he said something in that conversation, which is that the worst thing that a committee can do is make a plan and then it sits on a shelf for 10 plus years. And I think that this is a really good time, and this conversation, and as we look ahead to 2030, is a really good time to look at what the task force of government structure, what they recommended and why they recommended it. I think that because the referendum sort of failed, there was really no support for the changes that the committee recommended. It has largely gone in the back. People aren't talking about it. I mentioned TFOGs, and Rob Thomas, our newsletter editor, is like, remind me what that was. And so I think it's a good moment for us to look back at the work that has been done and not replicate work that has already happened.
That is such an astute answer, Jade. That is why I love having you on this team. I think the only thing that I'd point out, too, is just that I think Madison is a city that really believes in its local government and believes in the power of the people. And I am thankful that all the folks involved now in this revamped 2026 conversation, they are going about it in a very measured way. They're not rushing to make any changes. They're not rushing to put anything on a referendum right now. They're just saying, hey, these are the conversations that we want to be having. These are the conversations that we should be having. And I'm glad that we can bring this to the folks out here now, because I think civic engagement from the people, hearing the people sound off on this, is the best thing that we can possibly do here. So Jade Isiri-Ramos, thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Yeah, Haley, always happy to talk about what's going on in the city.
That's CityCast Madison producer Jade Isiri-Ramos. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm executive producer Haley Sperling, filling in for your host, Bianca Martin. Don't forget, you can support this show and get some great perks by becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor. Just head to membership.citycast.fm. And if you enjoyed today's show, why not share this episode with someone who's a career politician, or someone who hates politicians, someone who's just civically minded? Help spread the word about CityCast Madison. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care, and thanks for listening.